I think the idea that like men tyrannically dominated everything is a pretty damn weak argument. It's like you look around, I mean, I'm always amazed coming to a place like New York City. New York's an absolute miracle. It's impossible, this place, right? I mean, how many people come here a day? 7 million? It's fundamentally peaceful. Everything works, right? It's rich beyond belief. Everyone is doing better here than anybody has ever done on the face of the planet throughout recorded history. And the whole West is like that. And to call that all a tyrannical patriarchy is indicative of a very deep resentment and a historical ignorance that's so profound that it's indistinguishable from willful blindness. So look, every society has its tyrannical aspect and nothing is perfect, but we do not so bad in the West. In fact, you know, we do better than any place has ever done. And not only that, the principles that govern the West and the capitalist principles, the free market principles, the idea of individual sovereignty above all else has distributed itself across the world quite effectively, and everyone is getting richer, everyone. From the year 2000 to the year 2012, the rate of absolute poverty in the world fell by 50%. It's like, that's pretty good for a patriarchal tyranny. That was the fastest economic development in the history of the world.
You sound like a libertarian, are you?
I wouldn't say that I'm primarily a political person. I definitely believe that the West's idea that the individual is sovereign over the group is the greatest idea of mankind. I truly believe that. And I think it's metaphorically and literally true. And I think that if you don't treat yourself that way, and you don't treat the people immediately around you that way, and you don't base your society on that principle, that all hell breaks out very, very rapidly. People have been fed this diet of pablum rights and impulsive freedom for so long.
Free tuition.
Making quality childcare affordable.
You have a right to a living wage.
There's just an absolute starvation for the other side of the story. There are no rights, technically speaking, without responsibilities. And all we've had for 60 years is a dialogue about rights. Well, that leaves a hole on the other side of the story, and it's a hole that's in people's hearts, essentially. Because responsibility, well, perhaps that's not more important than rights. Like I said, they're part and parcel of the same formula. But it's in responsibility that most people find the meaning that sustains them through life. It's not in happiness. It's not in impulsive pleasure. Those things blow away at the first ill wind. But to adopt the responsibility for your own well-being and to try to put your family together and to try to serve your community and to try to seek for eternal truths and to live them, that's the sort of thing that can ground you in your life enough so that you can withstand the difficulty of life.
It's a little discredited now to say I'm a Marxist.
Yeah, you'd think so, wouldn't you? Except I think it's 1 in 5 social scientists identify as Marxist. So yeah, it's a little discredited, but it's nowhere near discredited enough. It should be as discreditable to say that you're a Marxist as it is to say that you're a Nazi, given what we know about the absolutely deadly consequences of the implementation of Marxist doctrine.
It's okay to hate trans people.
No, it's not okay, particularly to hate anyone, maybe even your enemies. And what I've talked about has virtually nothing to do in any real technical sense with trans people. The stance I took on Bill C-16 was an anti-compelled speech stance, and I stand by it.
Government.
Absolutely. There's never been a piece of legislation in the history of the English common law that compelled private speech. Not once. There has been legislation that compelled commercial speech. So, for example, if you sell tobacco, you have to put a warning on the product. But that's commercial speech. It's very, very limited, and even that's been extraordinarily limited. The Supreme Court in the U.S. in the 1940s came out and stated forthrightly that there was to be no compelled speech generated by the legislative and the executive branches, that was unconstitutional. And it violates English common law tradition. And the fact that it has to do with transgender people is virtually irrelevant. The issue is compelled speech. And if it wasn't the issue, this would have died away. All this scandal surrounding this would have died away 18 months ago. It's not what it's about. It's about the government and the ideologues that are pushing this sort of legislation, attempting to exercise tyrannical control over voluntary speech. And that's a no-go zone as far as I'm concerned.
So somebody wants to be called Z or Zer. Why not?
I don't care what people want to be called. That's fine, but that doesn't mean I should be compelled by law to call them that. The government has absolutely no business whatsoever, ever, governing the content of your voluntary speech. Like, I don't even like hate speech laws. I think they're a big mistake. And that says what you can't say, right? This is what you have to say. That's a whole different
So
ballgame.
you were personally willing to accommodate people if they want to be called something odd?
We could have a conversation about that, and if I was convinced that you knew why you were asking that was actually in your best interest, and you weren't just attempting to exercise ideological control over me for reasons that had absolutely nothing to do with you personally, then I might consider it in my private conversation, just like I would if you asked me to use a nickname, for example. So, but there's a big difference between privately negotiated modes of address and legislatively demanded compelled speech. It really has nothing to do with transgender people or, except peripherally, the transgender issue. There's been this attempt to identify masculine competence and power, let's say, but mostly competence with tyranny.
The problem is toxic masculinity.
Toxic masculinity.
And that's very, very hard on young men. It's also hard on young women, for that matter. But it's very helpful for people to hear that they should make themselves competent and dangerous and take their proper place in the world.
Competent and dangerous? Why dangerous?
Because it's the alternative to being weak. And weak is not good. The people who shoot up the high schools, they're weak. They're weak.
How is it good to be dangerous?
Because it makes you formidable. And life is a very difficult process, and it's not for, you're not prepared for it unless you have the capacity to be dangerous. That doesn't mean that you should be cruel. It doesn't mean any of that. There's a statement in the New Testament, the meek shall inherit the earth. But the meek isn't well translated. It means something more like, those who have swords and know how to use them but keep them sheathed will inherit the world. That's a way better way of thinking about it. You have to be powerful and formidable and then peaceful, in that order, right? And that's not the same as being naive and weak and harmless, which is what young men are being encouraged to be. It's like, that's a very bad idea. It's a very bad idea. Because naive, weak, and harmless means that you can't withstand the tragedies of life. You can't bear any responsibility. You'll end up bitter. And when you get bitter, then you get dangerous.
By dangerous, that implies I should be ready to threaten someone, to hurt somebody.
No, you should be capable of it. But that doesn't mean you should use it. There's nothing to you otherwise. Like, if you're not a formidable force, there's no morality in your self-control. If you're incapable of violence, not being violent isn't a virtue. People who teach martial arts know this full well, right? If you learn a martial art, you learn to be dangerous, but simultaneously you learn to control it. Both of those come together. And the combination of that capacity for danger and the capacity for control is what brings about the virtue. Otherwise, you confuse weakness with moral virtue. I'm harmless, therefore I'm good. It's like, no, that isn't how it works. That isn't how it works at all. If you're harmless, you're just weak. And if you're weak, you're not going to be good. You can't be, because it takes strength to be good. It's very difficult to be good. The legislation that I objected to also writes a social constructionist view of human identity into the law.
Social constructionist? Nobody knows what that means.
It means it's the theory that underlies the proclamation that gender identity is only a social construct, is only something you learn, it's only a performance, that it has no grounding in biology. That's wrong. Now it's written into our law.
Why is it wrong? Lots of people believe this. If it weren't for our sexist society, we'd be much more alike.
That's actually not the case. The science on that is absolutely clear. So as societies become more egalitarian, and this is mainstream science, by the way, this isn't pseudoscience, this is mainstream science, and it was discovered by people who are basically liberal or left-leaning, so it went against the grain, which is part of the reason why it's actually reliable. As societies become more egalitarian, the differences between men and women increase rather than decreasing, and that happens for personality. It happens for spontaneous interest, like the domain of your interest, which is basically people versus things. And it happens for the probability that women will enroll in STEM fields. So the more egalitarian the society, the lower the probability that women will enroll in STEM fields. And that runs contrary to the desires of the researchers who generated the data, because no one wanted that. It came as a shock to everyone, but that's how it is.
That's what they found.
And those papers have been cited. They've studied tens of thousands of people in dozens of countries, and the papers have been cited thousands of times.
And yet when you say this, it infuriates some people.
No, it should infuriate them because I'm going right after the heart of the radical leftist doctrine. So it's no wonder they're infuriated.
The radical leftist doctrine, which is,
Well, partly it is that human identity is purely learned. And the reason that radical leftists believe that is because they believe that if there's no central human nature, then human beings can be transformed sociologically, politically, into the image that the radical leftists would prefer.
which would be,
Oh, God only knows, the new man or some bloody thing like that. The sort of thing that the communists were touting back in the 1920s. The reshaping of society on an egalitarian basis with equality of outcome for everyone. All these unbelievably pathological and divisive and deadly ideas.